Bullies cut her school tie. Her headbutt left them in shock. The morning sun cast long shadows across the brick facade of Riverside High School as Kenna Thorne clutched her worn leather satchel tighter against her chest. Her auburn hair hung in a curtain around her face, partially obscuring the freckles that dotted her pale cheeks. At barely 5 feet tall, with a slight frame that seemed to disappear into oversized sweaters, she moved through the bustling hallways like a ghost, hoping to remain invisible until the final bell. Kenna had been attending Riverside for 3 months now, ever since her family moved from Montana to this sprawling Texas suburb. The transition had been anything but smooth. Her quiet demeanor and tendency to keep to herself had marked her as different from day one. While other students formed their cliques and social hierarchies, she found solace in the library's far corner, surrounded by dusty volumes of classical literature and the comforting silence that books provided. What her classmates didn't know was that beneath her timid exterior lay years of disciplined training. Back in Montana, her father had insisted she learn Krav Maga after a series of break-ins in their rural neighborhood. Every evening for 4 years, she had practiced strikes, blocks, and defensive maneuvers in their converted garage. The training had become second nature, muscle memory ingrained so deeply that her body could react without conscious thought. But here at Riverside, she kept that part of herself buried, determined to avoid conflict at all costs. The first sign of trouble had come during her second week. She was navigating the crowded cafeteria when a tall, broad-shouldered student with perfectly styled blonde hair and a letter jacket deliberately stepped into her path. This was Blake Morrison, star quarterback and undisputed king of the senior class. His ice-blue eyes held a cruel gleam as he looked down at her, flanked by his constant companions. Derek Walsh, a stocky wrestler with a buzz cut and permanent sneer, and Madison Price, a sharp-featured girl whose beauty was matched only by her vicious tongue. "Watch where you're going, freak," Blake had said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. When Kenna mumbled an apology and tried to step around him, he shifted again, blocking her path. "I said watch it. Are you deaf or just stupid?" The cafeteria fell silent, all eyes turning to the spectacle. Kenna's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she finally managed to slip past them, their laughter following her to an empty table in the back corner. That incident had established the pattern that would define her next 3 months at Riverside. The bullying started small, but grew progressively worse. Blake and his crew would accidentally bump into her in the hallways, sending her books scattering across the floor. They'd make loud comments about her appearance whenever she passed, calling her Raggedy Ann or the Scarecrow. During chemistry class, Derek once poured water on her chair before she sat down, leaving her with a conspicuous wet spot that prompted snickers from classmates for the rest of the day. Through it all, Kenna endured in silence. She told herself it would pass, that engaging would only make things worse. Her father had taught her that violence should be a last resort, used only when absolutely necessary for self-defense. These were just words and pranks, she reasoned. She could handle words. The library became her sanctuary, particularly the secluded study alcove on the 3rd floor where she could disappear for hours. It was there, surrounded by towering bookshelves and filtered sunlight, that she first noticed Marcus Chen reading quietly at a nearby table. He was tall and lanky, with kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, his dark hair falling across his forehead as he concentrated on his textbook. Unlike the other students who seemed to exist in a constant state of social performance, Marcus appeared genuinely absorbed in learning. Over several weeks, they began exchanging shy smiles and eventually quiet conversations about literature and philosophy. Marcus was thoughtful and articulate, with dreams of studying journalism at Columbia University. He treated Kenna with a respect and gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the daily cruelty she faced elsewhere in the school. Slowly, something tender began to bloom between them. Their first real conversation happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Marcus found her struggling with a particularly difficult calculus problem. He slid into the seat across from her without invitation, his presence warm and reassuring. "Mind if I help?" he asked, his voice soft and careful. "I took this last semester." As he walked her through the problem, their hands briefly touched over the textbook. The contact sent a small thrill through Kenna, and she found herself looking forward to their afternoon meetings with increasing anticipation. Marcus never asked about the bruises on her arms or the way she flinched when people approached too quickly. He simply accepted her as she was, creating a small pocket of peace in her otherwise turbulent world. But even this refuge couldn't remain secret forever. Blake and his friends had noticed Marcus's frequent disappearances to the library, and it didn't take long for them to discover the reason. The revelation that the school's biggest loser had found someone to care about her provided them with new ammunition. The escalation began on a crisp October morning when Blake cornered Marcus outside the gymnasium. Kenna watched in horror from across the courtyard as Derek shoved Marcus against the brick wall while Madison recorded everything on her phone. Blake's voice carried clearly across the space. "So you're the freak's boyfriend now?" "What's wrong with you, Chen? Can't find a real girl?" Marcus tried to walk away, but Derek grabbed his backpack, jerking him backward. "We're not done talking to you, Four Eyes." Kenna felt her muscles tense, every instinct screaming at her to intervene. But she forced herself to remain still, knowing that her involvement would only make things worse for both of them. Marcus endured the harassment with quiet dignity, refusing to rise to their taunts even when Blake knocked his glasses off his face and ground them under his heel. The next few weeks brought a new dimension to Kenna's torment. Now they targeted Marcus as well, tripping him in the hallways, vandalizing his locker, and spreading rumors about their relationship. The cruelty was systematic and relentless, designed to isolate them both from any potential allies. The breaking point came on a frigid November morning. Kenna was walking to her first period class when she felt a sharp tug at her throat. Madison had grabbed her school tie, a requirement of Riverside's dress code, and was pulling her backward with surprising strength. "Look at this pathetic thing," Madison announced to the gathering crowd. "It's so old and ratty, just like everything else about her." Blake appeared beside them, producing a pair of scissors from his backpack. "Maybe we should put it out of its misery." "Don't," Kenna whispered, but her voice was lost in the excited murmur of students forming a circle around them. She tried to pull away, but Madison's grip was firm. "Hold still, freak," Blake said, positioning the scissors at the base of her tie. "This is for your own good." The metal blades cut through the fabric with a sharp snick, and Kenna's tie fell to the floor in two pieces. The crowd erupted in laughter and cheers as Blake held up the severed fabric like a trophy. Madison released her grip, and Kenna stumbled forward, her hand instinctively going to her throat where the tie had been. But it was Marcus's reaction that truly shattered her composure. He had pushed through the crowd and was kneeling beside her, his face pale with anger and concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "Oh, how sweet," Blake sneered. "The losers are comforting each other." Something snapped inside Kenna as she watched Marcus's jaw clench with helpless rage. Here was someone who genuinely cared about her, someone kind and decent and brave enough to stand with her despite the consequences, and these bullies were targeting him because of her. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice surprisingly steady as she rose to her feet. Blake laughed. "What did you say, freak?" "I said leave him alone." Kenna's voice carried a new edge, something cold and dangerous that made several students step back instinctively. "He hasn't done anything to you." "Neither have you, really," Blake said with a casual shrug. "We just don't like you. Deal with it." The crowd began to disperse as the first period bell rang, but Blake wasn't finished. He kicked the pieces of Kenna's tie across the floor, grinding them under his heel with the same deliberate cruelty he'd shown Marcus's glasses. "See you around, freak," he said, walking away with his followers in tow. Kenna knelt to collect the ruined fabric, her hands shaking with suppressed fury. Marcus helped her gather the pieces, his touch gentle and patient. But when their eyes met, he saw something new in her expression, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm sorry they're doing this to you because of me." "Don't apologize," Marcus replied firmly. "None of this is your fault." But Kenna knew it was time to stop being a victim. That afternoon, she skipped her last period and went home early, claiming illness. In the privacy of her bedroom, she pulled out the old training gear she'd packed away when they moved to Texas. The heavy bag her father had installed in the garage called to her like an old friend. For the first time in months, she let herself remember what it felt like to be strong. Her fists struck the bag with satisfying thuds, each impact releasing a small portion of the rage that had been building inside her. She practiced combinations she hadn't used in years, her body remembering the fluid motions of combat. But this wasn't about becoming a fighter. It was about reclaiming her dignity and protecting the person she cared about. Blake and his friends had mistaken her silence for weakness, her restraint for helplessness. They were about to learn the difference. The next morning, Kenna dressed carefully, replacing her ruined tie with a new one from her dresser drawer. She walked through the hallways with her head held higher than usual, her movements more purposeful. Several students noticed the change, whispering to each other about the new confidence in her posture. Marcus met her at their usual table in the library, relief evident in his expression. "You seem different today," he observed. "I feel different," Kenna admitted. "I'm tired of being afraid." "What are you going to do?" She looked into his kind brown eyes and felt her resolve strengthen. "Whatever I have to." The confrontation came sooner than expected. During lunch, Blake and his crew cornered Marcus outside the cafeteria, their intention clear from the predatory way they moved. This time, however, Kenna was ready. She appeared at Marcus's side before they could touch him, her small frame somehow commanding attention from the much larger students. "That's enough," she said, her voice cutting through the afternoon air. Blake looked genuinely surprised to see her. "Well, well," the freak finally grew a spine. "I'm only going to say this once," Kenna continued, her tone deadly calm. "Stay away from him. Stay away from both of us." Derek burst into laughter. "Or what? You'll cry on us. Or I'll make you regret it." The simplicity of her threat seemed to amuse them even more. Madison pulled out her phone again, eager to record whatever humiliation was about to unfold. A crowd began to gather, sensing drama. "You know what?" Blake said, stepping closer. "I think we need to teach both of you a lesson about your place in this school." He reached for Marcus's shoulder, intending to shove him against the wall as he had before. But this time, Kenna moved. Her reaction was so fast that most observers missed it entirely. One moment Blake was reaching for Marcus. The next, he was doubled over with Kenna's fist buried in his solar plexus. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a sharp wheeze, and he staggered backward, his face turning red. "What the hell?" Derek lunged forward, but Kenna was already moving again. She ducked under his wild swing and came up with a sharp elbow to his ribs, followed immediately by a knee to his midsection. Derek folded like a house of cards, gasping for breath on the concrete. The crowd erupted in shocked exclamations. This was not the cowering victim they knew. This was someone else entirely, someone dangerous. Madison screamed and rushed forward, her manicured nails aimed at Kenna's face. But Kenna caught her wrist and twisted, using Madison's own momentum to spin her around and push her firmly to the ground. Blake had recovered enough to charge forward with a roar of rage, his fists swinging wildly. But Kenna was no longer the frightened girl who had endured months of torment. She was a trained fighter, and her body moved with lethal precision. She slipped his first punch and countered with a sharp jab to his nose, feeling cartilage give way under her knuckles. Blood sprayed across his Letterman jacket as he stumbled backward, his hands flying to his face. "You broke my nose!" he screamed, his voice muffled by his palms. "I'm just getting started," Kenna replied, her voice eerily calm. Derek had regained his feet and was circling her warily, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine fear. "You're crazy," he muttered. "No," Kenna said, her green eyes locked on his. "I'm just done being your victim." Derek rushed her again, this time trying to tackle her around the waist, but Kenna twisted aside and brought her knee up hard, catching him in the stomach. As he doubled over, she grabbed his head and pulled it down while driving her knee upward. The impact sent him sprawling across the pavement, blood streaming from his mouth. Blake, still clutching his broken nose, looked around desperately for help. But the crowd of students just stared in fascination, their phones recording every moment of his humiliation. He had ruled this school through fear and intimidation, but now he was the one afraid. "This isn't over," he spat, backing away from Kenna's advancing form. "Yes, it is," she replied, "but not because you say so, because I say so." She moved toward him with fluid grace, her training evident in every step. Blake threw a desperate punch, but she caught his wrist and twisted sharply, sending him to his knees with a cry of pain. For a moment she stood over him, her hand drawn back for the finishing blow that would end his reign of terror once and for all. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see if she would cross that final line. But then Marcus's voice cut through the tension. "Kenna, that's enough. You've won." She looked up at him, seeing the concern in his eyes, and felt the rage begin to drain away. Blake knelt before her, defeated and humiliated, his followers scattered and broken. The power was hers now, the choice of what to do with it. Slowly, she lowered her hand and stepped back. "Get up," she said quietly. Blake struggled to his feet, his face a mask of pain and humiliation. Blood from his nose had stained his perfect uniform, and his carefully styled hair hung in his eyes. "I could have hurt you worse," Kenna continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent crowd. "I could have done to you what you've been doing to us, but I'm not like you." She turned to address the gathered students, many of whom had stood by and watched months of bullying without intervening. "This is what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness, when you think that being quiet means being helpless." Blake opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off with a look that froze the words in his throat. "We're done here," she said. "Don't make me remind you again." As the crowd began to disperse, whispering excitedly about what they'd witnessed, Marcus approached her cautiously. "Are you okay?" he asked. Kenna looked down at her hands, surprised to find them steady. "I think I am, actually." "Where did you learn to fight like that?" She smiled for the first time in weeks. "Montana. My dad insisted I learn how to protect myself." "Why didn't you do this sooner?" "Because I didn't want to become like them," she said, watching Blake and his friends limp away. "I still don't." The days that followed brought a dramatic shift in Riverside's social landscape. Word of the confrontation spread quickly, and students who had previously ignored Kenna now treated her with a mixture of respect and wariness. Blake and his friends, nursing their wounds and their wounded pride, gave her a wide berth. More importantly, the culture of casual cruelty that had defined so much of the school's social interaction began to change. Other students who had been targets of bullying found their voices, emboldened by Kenna's example. The hallways became a little safer, a little kinder. Blake himself seemed fundamentally changed by the experience. Gone was the swaggering confidence that had defined him since middle school. He moved through the halls quietly now, his eyes downcast, the specter of his public defeat following him like a shadow. 2 weeks after the confrontation, he approached Kenna at her locker. She tensed instinctively, but his body language held no threat, only exhaustion and something that might have been remorse. "I want to apologize," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the hallway noise. Kenna studied his face, looking for signs of deception or mockery. But all she saw was a young man who had been forced to confront the reality of his actions. "For what?" she asked. "For everything. For making your life hell. For going after Marcus. For being—" He struggled with the words. "For being the kind of person who would do that to someone." "Why?" Blake was quiet for a long moment. "Because I could, I guess. Because it made me feel powerful. Because I thought that was what being strong meant. And now? Now I know the difference between being strong and being a bully," he said. "What you did that day, standing up for someone you cared about, protecting yourself without becoming cruel, that's real strength." Kenna felt no satisfaction in his defeat, only a weary sadness for the waste of it all. "I accept your apology," she said finally. "But apologizing to me isn't enough. You need to apologize to everyone you've hurt." Blake nodded, understanding the magnitude of what she was asking. "I will." As he walked away, Kenna felt a chapter of her life closing. The quiet girl who had arrived at Riverside 6 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to defend it. Marcus appeared at her side, as he had every day since the confrontation. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Different," she admitted. "Stronger, but not in the way I expected." "What do you mean?" "I thought being strong meant being able to fight," she said. "But it's more than that. It's knowing when to fight and when to walk away. It's standing up for yourself without losing yourself in the process." Marcus smiled and took her hand. "I'm proud of you. For beating up Blake. For showing mercy when you could have destroyed him. For being better than they were." As they walked down the hallway together, Kenna reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had learned that silence in the face of cruelty was not peace, but surrender. That sometimes the only way to stop violence was to meet it with decisive action. But most importantly, she had learned that true strength lay not in the ability to hurt others, but in the wisdom to know when that ability should be used. The girl who had cowered in corners and accepted humiliation was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that respect was not given freely, but earned through courage and character. She had found her voice, her strength, and her place in the world. And in Marcus, she had found someone who saw her not as a victim or a fighter, but simply as herself, complex, flawed, and worthy of love. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Building a better school, a better community, a better version of herself. These were challenges that would require not just physical courage, but moral courage as well. But for the first time since arriving at Riverside, Kenna felt ready for whatever came next.